Did you, on or about that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Kaylee Goncalves, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice aforethought?
Yes.
This guy, Bryan Kohberger, the man who viciously murdered 4 college students at the University of Idaho, is still making trouble for the families of the victims behind bars. And wait till you hear his new arguments for why he shouldn't have to fork over any more money to them. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. All right, before we jump into this is a Law&Crime legal alert. So there are allegations right now claiming that online apps like DraftKings, ESPN Bet, BetMGM, Bet365, Fanatics Sportsbook, Caesars Sportsbook, that they are engineered for addiction. These multi-billion-dollar companies allegedly continue to put profit over safety. Every small payout, free bet, boosted parlay, that can trigger a dopamine rush that creates dependency and a destructive habit. They can keep users feeling hooked and trap people in a cycle that can lead to serious financial loss. Well, I'll tell you what, our legal sponsors, they are taking on the online gambling industry to seek justice and potential compensation. So if you or a loved one has struggled with addiction, financial hardship, or mental health issues due to sports betting apps, then visit gamblinglawsuits.com/sidebar to take a short quiz and check your eligibility to file a claim. You would think that the man who brutally murdered 4 college students in cold blood, the man who admitted to this.
Did you, on November 13th, 2022, enter the residence at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, with the intent to commit the felony crime of murder?
Yes.
Did you, on November 13th, 2022, in Latah County, state of Idaho, kill and murder Maddie Mogen, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice aforethought?
Yes.
And we know that he pled guilty, by the way, to all the murders here. Kaylee Goncalves, Maddie Mogen, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, by the way, as well as to burglary. And we know that he was sentenced to 4 consecutive terms of life in prison. Now, you would think that this guy, Bryan Kohberger, as he languishes away in a prison cell forever, that he could do no more harm to the victims' family members, right? Doesn't seem to be the case. His legal team is essentially arguing that he doesn't have to pay the victims' families for what he did, or anything more. Arguing in part, you know what? They got paid enough from GoFundMe campaigns that were set up. So let me explain this, okay? When Kohberger pled guilty, he was also ordered to pay restitution as well. It's basically reimbursing victims' family members for the crime. Now, it appears the parties, at one point, the prosecution and the defense, they agreed that he should pay about $29,000. So in the filing that establishes this, the stipulation, there was over $14,000 that was going to be owed to the Crime Victims Compensation Program, which was established in Idaho to assist victims of crime with costs related to treatment for injuries sustained as a result of a crime. That's actually the definition. Almost $6,000 to Jim and Stacy Chapin, and over $8,800 to Jeffrey Kernodle. However, prosecutors had apparently requested that the court order Kohberger to pay an extra $20,000 for Kaylee's parents, Christy and Steve Goncalves, and almost $7,000 to Madison's mother, Karen Laramie. And this was seemingly in relation to travel expenses and accommodations, at least according to the defense. Well, Kohberger's defense is rejecting this. They are fighting back. They're saying he shouldn't have to pay this. Why? I'm going to read you from the defense's filing, and it's titled, Defendant's Objection to the State's Request for Additional Restitution. It says in part, quote, the plea agreement is unambiguous about the restitution categories Mr. Kohberger agreed to pay, and once receipts and verification were provided, he stipulated accordingly. Given the express language in the plea agreement, the only additional receipts submitted that may fall within the contractual terms are those for the earns. The state has an obligation to stand by the terms of the plea agreement that Mr. Kohberger relied upon. And then they define in this what economic loss means under Idaho law. Things like value of property taken, destroyed, broken, or other harms, lost wages, and direct out-of-pocket losses or expenses, such as medical expenses resulting from the criminal conduct. Now, it doesn't include less tangible damage, such as pain and suffering, wrong death, or emotional distress. Then the defense argues, okay, if you take that definition, if you look here, the families, they argue, they've already been paid out from GoFundMe campaigns, citing how there was one for Madison and Kaylee that raised over $73,000. They cite how there's another one for Karen Laramie specifically that raised almost $49,000, and that this one was specifically for travel to attend hearings in the case. The defense then cites another GoFundMe for Steve and Christy that apparently raised over $85,000, again, for the purpose of travel and attending the hearings. They argue that these families didn't suffer an economic loss, what I defined before. Then Kohberger's defense makes another argument, that he can't pay it. They cite Idaho law on when the court should consider restitution to be appropriate in a case, that you have to look to, quote, the need and earning ability of the defendant. So they write, Mr. Kohberger has no ability to earn money or pay money given his 4 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years. Unlike other cases where the Idaho courts have ordered restitution for short and long prison sentences, Mr. Kohberger's is different. He will never have the ability to pay restitution, and even though he stipulated to restitution amounts, there is no foreseeable ability for him to ever make payment. Under Idaho law, he will never be able to profit by way of book, movie, or entertainment of any kind. And they are right. There is a reference in Idaho law that says that anyone who enters into a contract with somebody who's convicted of a crime to create a reenactment of the crime through a movie, a book, a TV program, or that there's some entertainment program that documents the accused's feelings or thoughts or opinions on the crime, that money that they make off of that has to go to the state treasurer. And then the state treasurer puts that money in an escrow account for the victims of these crimes. So to summarize, the filing says that these are the reasons that Bryan Kohberger shouldn't have to pay these additional amounts to the families. 1, the plea agreement specified funeral expenses and funds reimbursed through Idaho's Crime Victim Compensation Fund in an amount to be determined within 60 days from July 23, 2025. Mr. Kohberger stipulated to those amounts, resulting in court orders in the amount of $28,956.88 on August 29, 2025. 2, the additional funds sought do not qualify as an economic loss under Idaho code because Steve and Christy Goncalves and Karen Laramie received extensive funds through multiple GoFundMe campaigns that specifically asked for and covered the expenses sought. And 3, Mr. Kohberger has no ability now or in the future to pay restitution because he is serving 4 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years. And then it goes on to say, for all of the reasons stated above, Mr. Kohberger objects to the request for additional restitution. He waives his own attendance at a hearing on this matter and requests that he not be transported because his defense counsel will be present. So is he right? Let's talk about it. So now I want to bring in Mark Weaver, prosecutor, former Deputy Attorney General. Thank you so much for coming on. Really good to see you. Let's broad picture think about this. So first of all, is restitution common in murder cases? Does it depend upon which state we're talking about?
Yeah, victim restitution is driven by state law. And in most states, there's a fund that crime victims and their families can draw from. And normally we want to see the person who caused the crime, the criminal, in this case the murderer, putting money into that fund. But as so often happens, the people who commit these most violent crimes have very little financial resources. That appears to be what might be happening here in Idaho.
Yeah, I want to get into that. But generally speaking, how much usually is restitution? What have you seen? What have the amounts been?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. The victims' restitution funds are not meant to be a substitute for a civil lawsuit against, in this case, the killer. Every victim of crime has a criminal case that the prosecutors bring, but they also have a civil case where they could sue for the damages done to them. These compensation funds are typically supposed to reimburse for victims things like hotel costs, travel costs, out-of-pocket work costs. It's supposed to be restitution and compensation, not necessarily the sort of civil damages and punitive damages you might get if those victims were to sue the criminal in a civil case.
And let's get into this. Has anybody ever been able to pay it? I mean, we'll get into this. That's one of Kohberger's arguments. But before we get specifically into his case, how often can people actually pay it? And if they can't pay it, I hate to say this, but you know, practically, why even order it in the first place if there's no way they can pay it?
Well, Sean Combs paid it, right? But he's a rare defendant, a criminal who has so much money that he's able to make these payments. Judges routinely order fines and restitution, knowing full well that they may never be paid. In one of the cases here that Law&Crime covered that I'm prosecuting about a baby mauled to death by a pit bull, the judge ordered a fine. I don't expect that'll be paid. The defendant doesn't have that kind of money. In rare cases, if the criminal comes into money somehow, then it can be taken either from them directly or from their prison account.
I would imagine, and this is something that the defense said, it would make more sense in shorter prison sentences, right? If they get out in 2 years, they go back to a career for the rest of their life. If they're making an earning, if they have a career and they're making money, they have to, like, what, every month contribute to that fund or every month pay out that restitution. I mean, this will basically be a part of their life until they pay it off, right? It's like a debt. Is that how it usually works? So it makes more sense in shorter prison terms?
Yeah, what typically happens is the state victims compensation fund pays out the restitution to the victims or the family of the victims, and then they can seek compensation back from the criminal, as you said, if the criminal goes out and starts earning a job. So the salary can be leaned, if you will. Take money from the salary week by week, or if they come into other money, or if they own property, there can be a lien put on that. There's a lot of ways to go, but in this case, of course, we have a life sentence.
Yeah.
It's a difficult situation.
Let's talk about that. So let's get right. We'll start from the last argument, one of the middle arguments backwards. He's life in prison. There's no way he's getting out. And there's no ability for him to profit off of his crimes. I mentioned before, under Idaho law, he can't make an interview or a TV show. If he's in life in prison, there's no way he's earning money from behind bars, so I guess that's a fair argument for his defense to make. I mentioned it before, the Idaho law, if he were to enter into an agreement with some sort of studio or producer or what have you, and they make something that earns money, it goes, again, my understanding is to the state treasurer, who then puts it into an escrow account for the victim's family members. I guess that's a way that he could pay it off? Maybe I'm looking at it the wrong way.
Well, that's how it's supposed to work. These have been named Son of Sam laws based on the horrific killer in New York back in the 1970s. In some states, Son of Sam laws that go too far have been struck down on First Amendment grounds. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but let me give it for instance. Let's say he takes up painting as a hobby and decides to paint and then sell those paintings to people. He's not telling the story of the crime. Maybe he's painting landscapes. If the Idaho law were to stop that money from going forward, I could see his lawyers bringing a First Amendment challenge against that. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's one odd example that it could change the outcome here.
And it does make me wonder if you really had a defendant who was remorseful for their crimes and said, I want to help the victim's family members. I committed a terrible crime. I can't take it back, but maybe I can help them in some way. You might have a criminal defendant who does something from behind bars, earns money, and makes sure it goes to the victim's family members. I'm not saying that is even what Bryan Kohberger would do, because there's been no indication he feels any remorse or feels anything towards these families, but I guess that's a possibility.
Wouldn't you like to think that that should be the big picture here? He's not self-aware enough to know this. It's such a bad look by him, by the defendant, by his defense lawyers who are filing these motions saying, don't make him pay this money. The whole thing is tone deaf across the board. These families have been through so much suffering. The notion that you would actually have your lawyers fighting to stop some of these judgments being put in place is really troubling. Who's paying these lawyers to do this now that we know he's guilty and he's going to be in prison for the rest of his life?
Yeah, that's a good point. Why fight it? Why fight? If he can't pay it, he can't pay it. If they order him to pay it, what are they going to do? How are they going to punish him more? I mean, why even submit a filing like this? And look, I'm an attorney. I get it. I understand there's a legal argument to make for anybody. But at the same time, what's the practical point of doing this? It's not like the family members of the victims can go after his parents or Bryan Kohberger's family here, right?
Yeah, there's always a possibility of a negligent suit if the parents had some involvement. We don't know any facts like that. I don't think that's going to happen here. But your thought was the one that came to mind when I first read about this, which was these lawyers had a lot of things they could do that day. Why did they decide to do this, given that it sends such a terrible message that this man has never learned his lesson and apparently never will?
Should family members generally be paid for travel and accommodation to go to the court hearings? Is that something that restitution should cover?
That's the most common example of out-of-pocket expenses that are easy to prove. It's the emotional damages, the loss of consortium, the pain and suffering. That's so hard to quantify. But these families would not have had to travel to Idaho and stay in hotels and rent cars just to be able to come to these hearings, but for the fact that Bryan Kohberger committed these horrific murders. So this is classic victims' compensation. I'm glad states have these funds that other defendants pay into through their fines, and that helps create the pool for these funds. But in this case, the amount of money they might ever get is very small compared to the loss they all suffered.
And I gotta say, this is the big headline grabber here. I say this with the caveat I mentioned before. I understand a defense attorney, any attorney is trying to make it whatever legal argument they can make, whatever creative legal argument they can make, but you gotta know you're gonna get backlash for it. So the argument is, well, you know, they don't qualify, the victims' family members don't qualify for economic loss because they already got enough money from the GoFundMe pages. Optics-wise, it leaves a really bad taste. But from a legal point of view, is that an argument? I mean, isn't it separate?
I doubt that whatever GoFundMe money they raise is enough to cover all the out-of-pocket expense of these families, because every family member has the right to come to these hearings and be apprised. Some of them had to hire lawyers to protect their identities and advise them. Those are certainly out-of-pocket expenses. You're right. It's a horrible look. And, you know, I know lawyers have to do their job, but I get to choose what I do typically, and I don't want to be the one who sits down and types up that motion and says, you know, they got money from GoFundMe. Yeah. Why do they need anything more? It's just a really bad look for lawyers, right? It's a bad look for lawyers.
It's a bad look. I mean, but from a legal point of view, if this goes in front of a judge who's supposed to look at the black and white of this, is that an actual argument? If the judge looks and says, you know what, they got enough money through a GoFundMe to cover travel and accommodations. Again, I'm disagreeing with this argument. I think I'm pretty clear about that.
It's got to be reasonable. You probably know I sit as a part-time acting judge and magistrate over the years. I once had victims ask for compensation in a burglary case, and they wanted to have some of the stuff that had been broken replaced, and they wanted to have their house cleaned because the guy had eaten food in their house. But then they wanted also compensation to buy a dog and a new security system. And I drew the line at that because I said those are not out of pockets from this particular crime. So a judge does have to make sure that, in fact, the money that's being asked for was paid out of pocket because of this crime.
But does it matter how much money they have or how much they're earning through other sources, whether it's a career?
You know, that's because GoFundMe is such a recent phenomenon in American life. I don't think we have case law on that. The judge is going to have to use his or her best judgment. If I were the judge, I would not look at that money, again, because I know there are so many other expenses out there, but we could get new case law out of this.
And this is a unique case where you're seeing, I mean, if these numbers are correct, a tremendous amount of money that went through a GoFundMe because of the horrible, brutal nature of this crime and how the community and the nation wanted to help these victims' family members. So it could be interesting to see from a legal point of view. What about the argument, hey, listen, he signed this plea deal, the prosecution signed it, right? We all agreed, there was a stipulation to the amount that had to be paid as part of restitution. An agreement is an agreement, can't be changed, can't add anything.
Well, everyone who does crimes in Idaho are governed by Idaho law, and so he's going to have to follow Idaho law with respect to victims' compensation. Now, if there's an argument that once you sign this plea deal that you're going to have to pay the fines, the judge ordered fines and some compensation, this is just on top of that. It's all rather academic because, again, it's got this small prison commissary account. I think the state can only take out 20% of it, which in my world, that's a little low. I think maybe that'll be the other way. Maybe let the prisoner keep 20% and let victims take out 80%. But if you choose to do your crime in Idaho, then you're going to be bound by Idaho law.
In the off chance that Bryan Kohberger has supporters and they give him money, they donate him money, can that go to the restitution fund?
I think it could, and again, I'd have to look at the statute that prevents him from profiting from his crime. I told you these laws have been challenged based on First Amendment over the years. So if it's rather broad, it might not be enforceable, as frustrating as that might be. It's also an odd characteristic of serial killers that they have fan bases. It used to be back in the day, just fans would simply write letters and send photos of themselves, but now they have the ability to raise money and perhaps get it to him. If I'm the judge, I'm going to use that as a pool of money to give to the victims.
Two things. What do you think the judge is going to do here? And is it going to get to a judge? What's the process for this? Is this now going to be a long, protracted battle in the court?
I doubt we see any hearings. This is kind of motion that can be resolved on paper. Each side gets to make their point. The judge will issue an order. I don't imagine this is going to take much court time.
Now, while I have you, there's been some other Bryan Kohberger updates that I want to talk about. So it was reported that Kohberger had ended up agreeing to plead guilty, and there was a lot of question about why he did this at the time, that he ended up agreeing to plead guilty after the prosecutors had announced that his sister, Amanda Kohberger, was going to be called as a witness, that she was actually, by the way, going to be testifying for the defense as well as a mitigation witness for the sentencing phase. And I think there were probably a number of reasons that Kohberger pled guilty, partly because he couldn't get the DNA evidence tossed out. He was denied the ability to point the finger at other suspects, which I've gone on record and say is pretty disgusting, that he was about to point the finger at other suspects and then pleads guilty like just days later. It's like you knew you were basically pointing the finger at innocent people. But is that something, the timeline, that's interesting to you? I mean, do you think that that was a reason for why he decided to plead guilty? Either he didn't want his sister to have to go through it, maybe he was worried what she was going to testify to. Is that something you've seen in other cases? What do you make of that?
I have seen this in a lot of cases. Defendants often have a cold heart towards their victims, but they also often have a warm heart toward their family. In this case, he maybe didn't want to put his sister through this. That's one factor of many. You can't ignore the fact that they had this guy every which way. His lawyers knew that. I was with you on the notion that they shouldn't have been putting forward this some other dude did it theory when they knew he had done it. But when defendants make decisions to plead guilty, particularly when you're taking the death penalty off the table, I worked on a death penalty case a year ago where this happened. We brought the death penalty as a charge. We were willing to take it off the table under certain circumstances. And so the defendant had to make that decision whether he was willing to plead guilty. And so usually it's several different factors. And with somebody as odd as Bryan Kohberger, it's just hard to figure out what's going through his head when he makes that decision.
And I got to tell you, Mark, you wonder what this trial would have looked like, whether it could have inflicted even more pain. News Nation recently reported that Kaylee's sister posted a TikTok that the prosecution was poised to present evidence that some of the wounds that Kaylee sustained were inflicted after she stopped fighting Kohberger, saying, quote, "I don't want to speculate on what Kohberger was doing, if it was to cause pain or whatnot, but these wounds did not make a lot of sense." And she went on to say that investigators told her the wounds appeared to be, quote, experimental. That's pretty disturbing to say the least. And you do wonder, at the same time, I know there was mixed reaction about him pleading guilty, but in the sense of what this trial could have looked like, what jurors would have been exposed to, what the victim's family members would have been exposed to, it's pretty brutal.
This is hard stuff. I got into this line of work because I like doing jury trials. I like prosecuting violent criminals. But every time I do a trial, I'm reminded that those jurors didn't choose this. I chose this line of work. The jurors didn't. They got a summons in the mail. They were told to come to the courthouse. They're being responsible people. And then sadly, we have to subject them to some of the most horrific images they've ever seen in their life, which most of them will never get out of their heads. And of course, the family members have to sit there and see these images as well. It's one of the reasons why sometimes the best thing is to settle a case and let it plead out to something else, which is what happened here.
Mark Weaver, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Always good to be with you, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on X or Instagram. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.